Welcome to Armchair Preaching, a podcast of the First Presbyterian Church in Lakeland, Florida. This is a podcast about God's Word, the beauty of the gospel, and what it takes to communicate that truth to others. I'm your host, Pastor Zac McGowan, and on today's episode, Pastor John and I kick off our new series on the 7 deadly sins. We hope you enjoy the conversation. And welcome back, everybody, to Armchair Preaching. Back today in our individual armchairs in our individual offices with Pastor John, kicking off a new series this week on the 7 deadly sins. And you mentioned this in your message. This is a Lenten series, but it goes. You know, we started a couple weeks early because, as you said, we're overachievers.
We're overachievers.
Yeah. So, but I do want to talk. One of the things that we both mentioned in this week's messages is that, you know, we tend to want to avoid the topic of sin, especially as you quoted from the book. Well, we don't want to avoid the topic of sin as long as it's somebody else's, right?
Yeah,
if it's ours, that's when we want.
That's the stuff that drama is made of, and great, in movies that everybody loves, books, all that.
Yeah. So I think, from the standpoint of our own spiritual development, what is the value in digging into topics like this big, grand, universal topic of sin? What is the value in that for the congregation?
Yeah, it's a great question, because why would you want to voluntarily dabble into these topics that are going to make everybody uncomfortable, and especially when you and I both read off the list of topics that we're going to be covering, and anybody who might have some struggle with any of those things, we're consciously aware of those struggles. We know already they're going to be uncomfortable with those weekly topics, and I think the answer has to be that. To use words from a mutual friend of ours, Jerry Andrews, is that it's part of it is about getting the gospel right. We want to get the gospel right. We want to get his phrase is get the gospel right, get the gospel in, and then get the gospel out. And so if we're going to be faithful to what God has shown to us to be real and true about life and about this world and this existence and what is true in our own spiritual life, we have to include this. And otherwise, we are only a partial. We're only partial with our faith, and I can't remember who it was right now that Jesus without a cross, kind of a faith where there's just nothing really makes sense. But having said that, I can think of even my own conversion story was less about my own personal repentance of personal sin and more about what is true, what is ultimate. And for example, did the resurrection happen? It was only sort of after that I realized, oh, well, because I believe this is true, now I got to go look back in the story and see what else is true. And it's like, oh man, there's a lot of things that are true about me that are indeed, as we said, uncomfortable. And so we may not necessarily get there first, but we need to get there. We need to get there. And I mentioned, and you and I both mentioned, really the two-part of the gospel story, when there's 4 parts to it. Original righteousness is part 1. We both talked about the fall. Well, you talked specifically about the fall. We both I alluded to the fall, and then the problem of sin, the reality of the redemption in Christ, and then the ultimate restoration of all things, the end of all time. That's the 4-part gospel. And if we gut sin out of that, nothing from Genesis 3 through the cross of Christ makes any sense.
Yeah.
So that's why talk about these uncomfortable, big uncomfortable topics? There's what do you think?
Well, I always think about you were raised Catholic, so I was not raised Catholic, but I remember in the chapel services or the chapel buildings that we had on military bases, those were shared worship spaces, right? And so you had Catholic services that went on and then Protestant services. But I remember very distinctly as a child, we would go in to prepare for the Protestant service. And one of the things we had to do was move and some of them it was a flip. And then some of it was like on a chain, and you moved a crucifixion, the crucifix away, and then the plain Protestant empty cross in view. And there's something about remembering the crucifix, in our, and I know that the Roman Catholic theology about the Eucharist and the mass, the re-sacrificing, and we reject that theology. But there is something from a visual standpoint that is important for Protestants who tend to want to shy away, especially in our 21st century model of Christianity, which wants to shy away and diminish not just the topic of sin, but the personal impact of sin. Seeing that crucifix is a visual reminder of the reality of the price of sin and the cost that our salvation, the cost that actually had to be paid. And for Protestants, we have to do an intentional job of visiting that in order to understand the beauty of the empty cross. You have to remember that it was a full cross first.
Yeah.
And the reason that that's a full cross is not because, of some divine child abuse situation. It's because Jesus took on the sins of the world. You illustrated that, in a very bold way on Sunday, but that is why you have to spend some time in it. So that you understand the glories of salvation. You have to understand what that salvation, the alternative to salvation is eternal separation from God, is eternal damnation, is all the things that we don't, all the words we don't like to use. But that all starts with the problem of sin. And it should make us uncomfortable. I mean, I think there would be a spiritual problem with us if we were fetishizing sin, and
which has happened in the church as well.
Which has happened in the church as well too.
And I almost said it, but I imagine that I've got 8 weeks to say it at some point. But there have been plenty of times in the history of the church, and there are plenty of churches that are around today, that they seem to just dwell on the sin, completely forget about. In my analogy, the Act 1, they focus on Act 1, forget about Act 2. And that's a problem in and of itself. That's a different type of problem. Our problem, I think, is what you were describing. I've had people say to me, because growing up Roman Catholic, I have two crucifixes, three actually, that were all my parents. They're not mine. I got them from my parents. One of them's in my office, gets surrounded by a crown of thorns, and then one's on my cross wall at home, and the other one's in my garage as we come into the door. And all of them. One of them I had out with a friend who was arguing that smacks of Roman Catholicism, that smacks of the whole theology around communion. You can't have that up as a Protestant. And I finally had to say, he was actually on the cross, right? I don't have to accept all that theology, but I do think that there's value in having a moment where we can do exactly what you said. We can look at that cross, see Jesus hanging on the cross, and say that happened. What's important is to say, why did that happen? What do we understand that mean? And not to deny not to deny the image of that, because we're afraid that it's going to suggest something else. I think we've lost that, and I think we need to recover that. And I look, we're well aware that people are uncomfortable with even Good Friday services. It's not like we don't have a full house on Good Friday. They're uncomfortable with the Monday, Thursday service. We don't have a full house on Monday, Thursday service. Those are heavy, and this is heavy. But so again, I think it's important for us to know why these things happen that make people uncomfortable, because only then, and we say it every year, only then, don't go from Palm Sunday to Easter Sunday. We'll get that in early, and we're in the preseason Lent right now. Don't skip Holy Week. skip from
Yeah.
Palm Sunday to Easter Sunday and completely miss Thursday and Friday.
Well, and even the whole Lenten season is a preparation for Maundy, Thursday, Good Friday, so that the sweetness of Easter Sunday is more profound and is more palpable to understand the that's I quoted it. I said the same thing on this past Sunday. I've quoted it many times. You don't understand how great water is until you've been really thirsty. Otherwise, you take it for granted. If you're the kind of person like most of us in North America are, where you can go to your tap, or you're in the mentality where am I going to drink bottled water or flavored water or
I
tap
have
water?
options, yeah.
I have all these different options. Well, it's like, well, no, in certain parts of the world, having clean water, any kind of clean water, is such a luxury, and yet that's our salvation. Our salvation is finding Jesus Christ as the living water, because our souls are so spiritually parched as to be cracking and dusty, and it's that's why it's important to I don't say dwell on it is not the right word, but to just marinate in it,
Yeah.
and we make a
As
conscious
as
effort
opposed to ignoring it.
as opposed to ignoring it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or what our wider culture does is to just make it therapeutic. This is a sin is not the problem. It's a mental health problem, and there are mental health problems, and that's a result of the brokenness in the world. But it makes it where it's not my fault. The culture around us says, well, my problems are not my fault. They're the problems of other people,
Yeah.
and maybe in some cases that's true. But there are also we are also contributing to the brokenness in this world individually, and from a global perspective, this is a big answer to the problem of pain in the world. This is one of the reasons we have to go back and talk about sin itself, is because people ask, why do bad things happen?
Yeah.
And a big part of the answer, or the primary part of the answer, is, well, it's sin.
Yeah.
Bad
The
things
effects
happen
of
because
sin.
this
Yeah.
is the effects of sin, the
Yeah.
ripple effects of sin, the brokenness of sin
Even
creates the
creation,
situation.
even the natural disasters can be answered with the question that goes back to the source of this, which is the Genesis 3. It was the totality of the effects of the fall, where
Yeah,
they changed our relationship with God, they changed our relationship with each other, they changed that sin nature was in us, and they changed the world itself.
yeah, and that's
It's
why Paul writes in Romans 8 that the whole creation has been groaning as in the
groaning.
pains of childbirth from that day and he's referencing the fall until Christ returns, and that's another reason I think it's, from a discipleship standpoint, it's important to go back and revisit these stories and revisit these narratives and revisit the theology of sin, so that we have a real answer to that question, and an answer that goes beyond the moral therapeutic deism of so much of our culture, or even our Christian culture.
I wonder if there's any are there any other topics that are maybe uncomfortable to this magnitude, or maybe tried to be avoided to this magnitude? Any other topics that you can think of that we? I mean, I think we do a good job around here, even though this is a concerted effort to go through a series on sins. I think we do a good job around here of just talking about the reality of sin, and then and you did it, I did it. We do it every time. We balance that with the good news is always better than the bad news. So I think we do a good job with that. But is there any other topic that you can think of that we as a maybe Western Christians, or just Christians in general, get out of balance of and don't address nearly enough?
I Actually, I think we just did. I think we just did it in the previous series. I think the the spiritual discipline side of our faith. I think some, and I say Western Christians, again, I do think we do a good job of addressing these things on a regular basis, but that our faith in Jesus Christ should prompt us to live differently, and living differently means disciplines. And we don't like the word discipline. And that doesn't, and part of that is a correction of our sin nature. But part of it is, and a big part of it is living out of the gratitude of our salvation means that we do spend time in the Word of God, and we do spend time in prayer because we want to, not out of a guilt, but out of a sense of gratitude. And I think there, to a lesser extent, I think there are Christian traditions that try to avoid the discipline, even the word spiritual or the phrase spiritual disciplines, because it's like they don't want to lean into a works righteousness, sort of thing. And we've always talked about here from a, which side of the salvation equation are you talking about works? If you're trying to talk about, and I addressed it at the beginning of this message, this series, people who look the part but aren't really a Christian because they think they're still trying to earn their way into the presence of God, and they can't do that. So, but coming out because they don't understand the real problem. And so living into faith, though, does have certain requirements. Are there things that you can think of that are
well, as I answered that question, I asked myself that question because I didn't have an answer for myself when I asked you. But as you were talking, I said there is another one I think that we would do well to come back to, and it is one that makes people uncomfortable, and it's the subject of forgiveness. If as one person has said, the greatest gift that Christianity has brought to this world is the gift of what true forgiveness looks like. Just leaning in on that, and doing that in a way that ties our own forgiveness of another person and what that means, ties that to the forgiveness of God. That's a interesting hard wiring, because you can just do the as you were talking about, the more therapeutic deism, that we can do a therapeutic forgiveness, and there's great value in that. That if you're holding on to unforgiveness, a lot of times that's just chewing you up inside, not doing anything to them. So maybe your ability to forgive is good for them, but we don't tie that to anything larger, just that I'm going to feel better about myself. We don't tie that to the gospel message itself, that it starts with, if God, the God of the universe, in whom there is no darkness, there is no sin, and is all perfection, looks at you, the one who has been wronged, and sees your flaws, and still creates a way for you to be truly and connected with him through Jesus Christ, and the magnitude of the forgiveness that we have gotten by God ought to do a mental shift and have us look at other situations, say, well, if that can happen, then there's not too much that can happen in this world that I can't find myself ready to forgive. So I think that's another one. Maybe we'll do that. Maybe we still have the rest of the year to think about. Maybe we'll do that as a series. We just did the one on next steps and disciplines. Maybe we'll do forgiveness later on this year.
Yeah, and that's the other side of the sin conversation, right? Is the forgiveness. It's the outgrowth of, and I think the forgiveness piece will come up even in this series, because as we're talking about the virtues, even as I think about the idea of anger and patience, part of patience is forgiveness, being because if people sin against you, the sinful response when people sin against you is to be angry and to be torqued up and to be, fight back, and forget that no. As God has treated us with patience and kindness, so we also treat others with patience and forgiveness. And again, we've talked about this, not that does not give people license to walk all over us, but to be charitable in our understanding. So I think I do think you're right. I think it is uncomfortable. I think it will come up even in this series, because so much of our sin, our sinful reactions, I think, are the result of unforgiveness, or selfishness, that they can play out in that way. But yeah, you're right. Forgiveness is, when we talk about other people's sin, we like to condemn pretty strongly.
Grace for me, judgment for them.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah,
That's the
yeah.
model.
So we'll take a quick break and we'll get back and we'll dive into some of the specifics of this week's message, because we looked at two different passages this week. We had both of them in our
Services,
front
yeah.
viewer, but we did take a slightly different approach. So we'll be back in just a moment. And welcome back, everybody. This week we were kicking off the series on sin and looking at the broad topic of sin. We took slightly different approaches. In the notes, the pre-notes that we sent out, you sent out the summary of the series. Both of the passages of Scripture that we dealt with were kind of in the purview. You focused on to a larger extent the Luke 5. I focused on Psalm 51.
Yeah.
And so I wonder, when you're thinking about the problem of sin, what was the key focus for you in looking through that? What did that what was the place that you're like, yeah, if they come away with nothing else today, what did you hope that people came away with?
I think it's some of what we talked about in the first segment is that what is this thing? Why are we going to talk about this? Why do we need to talk about this? And then to hear that's the first part, and we have to get that right so that we can understand the second part, which is the good part, the part that everybody loves to talk about. And that part, as I said earlier, that part that some churches, that's all they do talk about is the grace that's shown to you, like you're not that bad, that type of thing. Mm-hmm. Whereas, coming out of the Presbyterian tradition, where we have total depravity, we believe that, yes, in between the condition between you and God, it is that bad. But that's also not the end of the story. Or as my friend once said, you're not all that bad for a person who believes in total depravity. You're not all bad. But that was on my mind, is to get that set, that the reality of sin has to be, and it really, we say for the good news to make sense, for the sermon series to make sense, it also needed to be established up front. It's like, all right, we're getting ready to go in this. Here's why. So that was much on my mind. It felt like, and yours felt like it too when I was watching you. It felt like like what it was, which is a series to set up a series. I mean, a starting sermon to set up the rest of the series.
Yeah.
How about you? What was the framework in mind?
I think, to me, I was really, we were thinking about the problem of why is sin such a problem? That was kind of the prevailing question that was guiding my thinking. And when you look at Westminster Shorter Catechism 14, which I mentioned in this sermon, and I've actually mentioned it in Vine a few weeks ago, it's so clinical, and as most of the questions in Westminster are clinical. And for those
really
that don't
like
know,
that contrast between that and the more narrative and poetic, as you said, Psalm 51.
Yeah. But I think it places, and nothing against the Westminster Divines. I love the Westminster Divines, but the issue I have with the answer to that question is it places the problem of sin from an entirely legal standpoint. Whereas when you read this, and that fails to, I guess that presumes the understanding that the law of God is given to us for our benefit and for our good. And so that the law of God comes from the heart of God, which is a heart full of love and grace. Well, that's a big jump for people who, when they hear the word law, they think legal, right? And that's where we get the whole idea of penal substitutionary atonement, which you and I both ascribe to. But there's a heartbeat that is much deeper and more profound than that. And I thought the Psalm 51 passages, and I did talk quite a bit about the narrative surrounding Psalm 51, or what we believe the narrative is surrounding Psalm 51. But really, I did that to really focus in on that the real issue is Psalm 51, 3 and 4, where David says, against you and you only, Lord, that the problem of sin is about the breaking of our relationship with the Father, first and foremost. And yes, there are consequences, human consequences, family consequences. You mentioned, some of the sins that aren't, that are implied by the seven deadly sins, but aren't explicit, that they do have like ripple effects that tear families apart, that tear, careers apart. That's real and that's important. But the reason that those things are important because there's a deeper issue, a divine issue, which is why there has to be a divine solution. So my hope was that we would look at the problem of sin as a problem with our relationship with the divine, realizing that only the divine can take care of that, which is why the mercy of God, which is so clearly seen to us in the person of Jesus Christ, and that Jesus, life, his death, and his resurrection all stem from that mercy and compassion that David is writing about in Psalm 51, and that the story of the call of Levi is so important. And I loved how you even backed up into Luke 5 to talk about the
healings.
What I heard in that was that the healings are not about the sin of the individual, but about the state of sin in the world, and that Jesus is addressing the physical brokenness, and then he's also addressing the spiritual brokenness. That all those that comes into play, and that and that's why I thought that going back into something I wish I'd done, and if it wasn't congregational meeting week and me kind of really watching the time of all that, like I probably would have gone back into the context of Luke 5, because I do think that there is tremendous, because it takes the individualistic out of it. Well, I say out of it. It balances the individualistic view of sin with the cosmic and corporate view of sin, which I think is both things are at play. Both things are at play there.
Yeah.
And I thought that was radically important.
Well, I thought that was very helpful too, and the song we had, Stephanie Cunningham was the assistant, and she did a responsive reading with Psalm 51. So we had that in another place in the service, but even with that, we did have the congregational meeting. So that's worth saying here on this behind the scenes is that we had a hard stop to get to, so we can get in the same room at the same time, and which meant that it was about 10 minutes less on the preaching side than is normal in that service, which is to pull all that off was a challenge. So which meant that basically the Psalm 51, I knew that if I was going to tell the story of Psalm 51, I would do exactly what you did, which was just tell the story of Psalm 51. Just let that story have its own weight, including Nathan's calling the king out on that. That's one of them. I think one of the most powerful parts of that is and yes, David responded with when he finally did respond, it was because Nathan had set him up and said, you think you're judging this other case, but you're actually the one who's done this. There's so many moments in that, and I love what you said about that how many commandments that he broke. At least half of the commandments. You probably even argue that all of the commandments in some ways he broke them. So it's such a powerful story. I wanted to say that obviously set the series up, but also to say a few things in general about the subject of sin. One of them was that salvation is not the question in mind here. That's not, because it really bothered me. I didn't say much about this. I just said it and moved on as a statement. But people they accuse Christians of being duplicitous, of being hypocritical, and basically being sinful. And I'm not. This is one I would love to have had a little more time with. I would love to talk a little bit about that. So yes, you are accusing us of being sinful. Well, the funny thing is that God is accusing us of being sinful as well. And we get that. And so, but what you're suggesting is that somehow ought to make us unqualified to speak truth. That ought to make us disqualified for being with God, and nothing could be further from the truth. It's the entire opposite. And so, and again, if you believe in total depravity, you're never surprised when people are doing something that is depraved. Even if you see it if you with your children and your family or wherever, you're never surprised that sinful people sin. And I think it was Tim Keller said that even in marriage, I think his definition included that marriage was two sinners who find each other and make a commitment to love each other. But the starting point is they're two sinners. What are two sinners going to do? They're going to sin. So you hope that they're not going to be bad ones, but they're going to be at least devastating ones. But they are going to be sins.
Well, and I think too, you setting that up in that way does help people understand that Christianity does not equal self-righteousness. And I think the people that accuse Christians of being hypocrites assume that Christianity, that when we claim to have faith in Jesus Christ, that we're also claiming moral perfection. And actually what true Christianity is the opposite of that. True Christianity, and that's what I was trying to do at the opening of the sermon, is true Christianity is the opposite of self-righteousness. It's the opposite of looking the polished part. It's the opposite of being, not, I mean, by definition, Christians are going to fall into the category of hypocrisy from time to time because we are always striving by the power of the Holy Spirit to do better. But that implies that we are doing worse from time to time. And so I think it was important that was said. And I think it was important that how you brought that out. And I want to ask you a little bit about the lining up of all the people and talking about individual sins. Now, I'm curious. This is insider baseball. So, did you set up anybody because I know that there were some. So you just opened that up to the floor at that point. Now, was that
there's a lot of thinking ahead of time that went into like, what happens if? What happens if nobody shows up? How many? I actually had 8 bean bags. What do I want to do? 4 bean bags? Do I want to do? And I settled on 6. And then I said, what? And then what kind of things might they say? What should I expect them to say? And then so there's a lot of that. So but then I said, all right, well, let's just see what happens. So I went for it.
Yeah.
So nobody was set up. No, they all came forward.
Yeah, I was curious because I've done things like that in the past, and I've usually asked 1 or 2 people if they would kind of volunteer to start, and then usually get the others, so there's more spontaneity there. But there have been other times where I haven't done that, and just in the spur of the moment, just put it out there, and every time people show up, people do that. But was there any sense of like, did you second guess yourself right before you did it, and then just push through, or were you pretty resolute?
No, I wasn't second guessing whether I was going to do that, but there was the moment where I was setting it up, and then I was and then when I said, okay, who will come forward to take this? And it's like,
That's when you jump out of that airplane. Yeah.
Yeah. 1 second. Okay. This is either going to be, it's going to tank right now, or it's going to work right now. And then Jason Albert stepped up, and right behind him, Kyle Merritt came up, and then the rest came up.
Yeah.
So
you usually just need 1 or 2 to get the ball rolling, and then the thought goes through your head is, what happens if I have 45 people come up and
Well, we did that.
They all want to participate.
Rachel and the Wiseman's son, whose name I can't remember right offhand. Luca came up. Yeah, Luca came up. He was so funny, and I told him afterwards, I'm so glad you came up. I appreciate it. But he says, Rachel and Luca joined together for the last one, and then and he said, I said, well, what's yours? And he said, remember what he said? He said, I guess I'm the sin of not following the instructions, or something like that. It was great. He slipped it in. I don't think most people caught it, but it was funny. And I said that to him as well afterwards. So he did great with that. So yeah, that was it. But once everybody got up there, and once they named some things, and they kept it presentable for the crowd. And
that's the other question mark too. That's the other question mark too, because you don't know what they're going to say.
Yeah. So what's your sin going to be? Well, I did think through this, that they're probably not going to say something too sort of edgy, because they're going to be standing up there especially by the time you got down the line a little bit, they're going to be the one holding the edgy one. So they don't necessarily want to be the adulterer guy or girl,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
although I did expect to
Yeah.
see that one come on the show up, and it didn't, which is okay. You had a couple of
Yeah.
duplicates in there, which
Yeah.
is okay.
Yeah.
Um,
So what do you think the value was for the congregation in seeing something like that? That sort of display. What do you think the value is from the communication standpoint, the congregation being the receivers of
yeah.
that moment? What do you think the value is in that?
I think it's anytime you and I have done things like this where we're involving the congregation. I think there's yeah, I could feel it in the room. By the way, I could feel a shift in the room, that they're like, they're leaning in at this point. And they're like, what's about to happen? So I think there's an alertness, if there's value in that, and alone that
Yeah.
if they've been drifting off, for whatever reason, they're not drifting off in that moment because they're waiting to see what's about to happen. But I also think, just like any object lesson, it's a sermon illustration done in a dramatic way. And it's not big drama; it's just people standing up there. But still, there's this in an unusual way, and those tend to be memorable as well. I hope they're memorable. I hope that they will remember that the point was that
Yeah.
Jesus takes the guilt of all these things on himself.
When I see that, and when I saw that, I think through those, and it 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 gives people the opportunity to imagine themselves up there. It gives people the opportunity to understand this is a shared, the problem of sin is a shared problem. The
Yeah.
problem of sin is a problem that we all face. I felt like there was a communication of, you're not alone, in your, because I can imagine people sitting there thinking of they're not having to say it out loud, so they can think of the worst sins
Personal
that they
sin.
could come up with, and having people other than your voice, because you could have gone and verbalized all that, but the fact that it was Kyle's voice, and Luca's voice, and Jason's voice, made it so that they could put their own voice in there as well. I felt
Yeah.
like that was those types of moments, I feel like, are opportunities for people, even if they're not the ones standing up there, to be participatory in the message. And it brings their attention to mind, but it also, I think, helps land the application, which is a personal application of wrestling with
Mhm.
your own sin, if of understanding that the cross of Jesus Christ is for them, that even though Jesus is perfect, he took their whatever infidelity, their lies, their cheating, their thievery, their greed, whatever it is, theirs, as well as the people standing up there. So
I hope it did feel like good news, much in the same way that you saying to the congregation, and I assume you did this in the live version as well, not to be afraid to address your sin and to think about your sin and just to go there wherever your sin is. It's not like you don't know it. It's not like people
mhm,
are unaware of it. If somebody's is cheating on something or lying about something, or is in an adulterous affair, whatever it is, then they already know it. Just don't be afraid to go there, because the diagnosis is going to be met with a treatment.
yeah,
It's going to be, if that was the point. So I hope that was received as, and I just like, I mean, neither of us really, I don't know if you did. I've not really had much of a chance to hear a response to Sunday, because we went right from that into another a meeting, and then on to the rest of the day's activity. So I haven't heard much at all since
yeah,
then. But I hope I hope that they heard that well. Don't be afraid of the
mhm,
diagnosis, because the treatment is
yeah.
amazing.
Yeah, and you appreciate this, because this happens to you more often than it happens to me, because you preach the sermon in front of a camera, and then you preach the sermon in front of people, and it's very different when you're talking about cancer diagnosis in front of, and using that as which is not, this is not a novel metaphor, to talk about sin as the spiritual cancer of our souls, but very different when you're looking down the barrel of a camera, versus looking at people and go, I know you were just diagnosed with cancer. I know you
Yep.
were just diagnosed with
Yep.
cancer. I know you're in the middle of treatments. And so you're feeling this, your spouse is feeling this, your kids are feeling this in a particularly impactful way. Or I could look over and see folks that they've gone through it, they've come out the other side, and the purpose of that, those metaphorical shifts, is to help people understand the scary nature of sin that is, if left untreated by the power of Jesus Christ, is deadly. I mean, but the other side of it is a transformed life. Jesus is taking.
I love that.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
love you. I love
Yeah.
where you landed, by the way, that the treatment, no matter what these heavy topics are, whatever categories they are, whatever sin it is, no matter what it is, the treatment, as you said, is always the same. And it's one. Yeah, I felt like I was on an infomercial here. It's 100% effective, and there's no side
100.
effects.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
was great.
And actually, I did
Though.
adjust. I did adjust it in the live sermon, because I think online I said there's no side effects. In the live service, I said there's only one side effect, and that's a transformed life.
You said that. Yeah, you said that.
Yeah, because I think in my
No
notes I
negative side
actually
effects, I
had.
think.
Yeah. So it's not, we're talking about a subject that people have heard, whether they like it or not, but we have to keep revisiting it. And we're going to, and I think, we're going to, I jumped in a little bit to the Genesis 3 story. We're going to jump in a little bit more this week coming up, and talking about pride, because I think, not to preview too much, but the sin of pride, in some ways is the first sin, and it's the root of all other sins in so many ways. I think so. There'll almost be an extended introduction to the series. I think that's a
Just
fair.
because pride is such a large topic. It
Yes.
covers
Yeah.
everything else as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, we're going to take a short break. We're going to jump into the final segment where we talk through how you can really do some more devotional work on this, and then also how you can deal with this in your small group settings. So we'll be back in just a moment. And we're back. Segment number 3, Pastor John, devotional life, small group life. Where are you going with this? Where do you, if you're sitting with somebody and they're giving you the opportunity to be in their devotional presence, how are you getting them to start? How are you getting a small group to kick off this series?
That's a great question, especially since the subject is personal, and it's sin, and you're in a group. What do you do with that? A lot of that's going to depend on the group, but let me just start first on the personal side. What I would say, so anybody's going to listen to this and going to think, what am I going to do with this personally? I think it would be a prayer of examine would go a long way, which is this is self-reflective moment of honesty. You don't have to tell another soul. You don't have to write it down. Just answer the question. What are those places? What are those sins in my life that I am prone to commit?
Mm-hmm.
What are the sins of commission, the things that I do? What are the sins of omission, the things that I don't do, but I should do? What are the sins that I'm prone to commit? And I think the tricky ones, one we left off with in the last segment, there is like, how does pride manifest itself as the key? What C.S. Lewis called the greatest sin. I think greatest secret, greatest sin. Anyway, how does that? I'm gonna look it up and use it Sunday. That's what I'm gonna do. But how does that manifest itself in your life? What does pride, with this inordinate focus on self and not being God-centered, but being centered, how does that manifest itself in life? And then just what are the other particulars that come into your life? Do you struggle with anger? I know plenty of people who they understand that their fuse is that short, and they can be hot in a nanosecond. I know people who struggle with lust. Maybe that's it, in various forms of lust, and maybe I know people who have. I mean, there's eating disorders, and then there's just obsession with food, or just obsession with more, just the more and more and more. That's the Amazon addictions, and the I get the dopamine hit from the Amazon boxes, that type of thing. So where is it? That would be a great starting point for an individual. And I will say this, probably a good starting point for a group, if you had the kind of group that can handle that, and not
Yeah.
every group can.
Yeah, and if you're, I think in a group setting, if you're trying to kind of ease into this topic, I think when you're dealing with it devotionally, don't be afraid to I think go hard on. I don't say go hard on yourself. That sounds like you're lashing yourself and doing the flagellation like the monks. But don't be afraid to really do the hard
Well,
work.
be honest.
Yeah, and be honest. I think in a group, like you said, really depends a lot on the group setting. And if you've been together for a long time, you can get a lot more intimate and authentic more quickly. But I think if you're trying to ease into it, I would start by just saying, what is your immediate reaction? What is the group's immediate reaction to having a conversation about sin, in general? And are they afraid of it? Are they apt to try to skip some weeks, of the group and skip some weeks of the sermons because they don't want, and why is that? And just talk about the discomfort or relative comfort with sin, that idea
Yeah.
of sin itself, and where does that come from?
And
For them personally.
what's happening internally with them when someone does begin to bring it up in a way that could suggest. A lot of times there are people in groups who they don't really care who knows their stuff, and
Yeah,
so they're just going to put it out there, and a lot of people see those people, and they're just they find them refreshing and valuable, because there's somebody who would just say, I really struggle with, and they'll tell you, I really struggle with pornography, or I really struggle with just the dopamine hits of the Amazon things, the boxes. I really struggle with whatever. And then there are other people that as soon as they hear someone do that, the anxiety level begins to rise inside of them, because they fear they're about to be judged off of the planet, and judged off the island, so to speak. That they're just it's too anxiety ridden, they shut down. So it'd be worth even talking about, how do you respond? It'd be good, a group facilitator, and you have a big group. If you're thinking about this with yours, it would be mindful of the process that how people are processing all this, and asking everybody to be honest about, not even to say I struggle with, just say to talk about something like that does this to me. That'd be a good conversation, I think.
Yeah. And I think relative to that, when they have, what is it? And you talked about confession, in your sermon. And I would, from a personal standpoint, go through the acts of confession and repentance. But then in a group setting, ask the question, what does that look like to an individual? How do they have a practice of confession? And I've gone through different practices of confession. I've used rote prayers. I've used journaling. I've used a lot of different things, just depending on where I'm at in my own journey. But I would talk to people about the subject of confession as well, too. What does that look like? One of the interesting topics in a group setting, that it's a little bit easier to approach it, but I do think it will be controversial in a group, is to say, how do people feel about that Psalm 51, passage where David says,
God alone, against you alone.
An exclusivist look at the shame that he feels as he breaks. I mean, how do they feel about that versus the reality. Not that is reality, but how do they feel about that gradation of guilt, where Uriah is not mentioned, Bathsheba is not mentioned, the dead infant child is not mentioned, and what
Or
does
in the
that tell us
personal
about the
case,
nature of
my
sin?
my personal my personal sin that I'm committing, the one that we would have been talking about a moment ago, the language in that is that now I'm going to say to God that when I was doing those things, I did them to you. I sinned against
Hmm.
you. How do they feel about that?
Yeah,
Yeah, great
yeah,
question.
yeah, yeah. Because I think there is something about when we overly, and I don't want to diminish the human effects of sin, because they are significant. I mean, you talked about it in your sermon, the abuse and political corruption, and there are human effects, and those are important. But when we leave it at the human effects of sin, and we don't really wrestle with the more significant eternal divine effects of sin, um, then our repentance and our confession then becomes a moralistic, to kind of utilitarian. I want to be better so that I'm better for my spouse. I
Mm-hmm.
want to be better
Mm,
so that I can be better for my children. And not that that's not a worthy secondary goal, but the
sure.
primary goal is I've broken relationship with God, and Jesus Christ has died for this sin. And so I need to do the heart and spirit work to get back. But that's a, go back full circle to the opening of this podcast, this episode. That's a big spiritual journey to get to that mentality. And so I think in a group setting, working through the emotional angst,
Mm,
because
mm-hmm.
I have that emotional angst every time I read Psalm 51. It bubbles up every time. Like, but okay, I get it. I know. I get this, but here in my heart, it feels like you're ignoring all of the damage that you've done, and to the kingdom, and to his own. I mean, the rest of his, I want to talk about this in the sermon, but the rest of David's life goes really poorly from that point on. I mean, he starts to have all sorts of problems after that. And so anyway, I think that would be an interesting conversation to have in
I'll
a
throw
group setting.
one more out, and that is that we're talking about sin nature. We're talking about the problem of sin, but there's also the life, the alternative to that. And what does it look like to live the alternative life to the particular sins? But so somebody does struggle with anger. What's it look like I mean, it's unrighteous anger too. There's righteous anger. What does it look like to have someone who's not like that?
Mhm.
That'd be worth just painting a mental picture of a person who's living the kind of life where they've got all the dots connected. They go back to those deep places that you're talking about. They understand that sin itself in its manifestation in an individual life, first and foremost, is the affront to God, and the need to restore that comes through Jesus Christ. They've got that figured out, but they also got that striving to live otherwise, go and sin no more mindset as well. So what does it look like? Do they know anybody who would be sort of living that out differently? I think, and when I say that, I'm thinking about um, the stages of faith. James Fowler's book, The Stages of Faith, which is following a very um, stage-like development of a person's faith, and each time there's a little progressively more sort of depth and more maturity and all. But the ultimate one is the person who's just really kind of, they call it the universalist approach, not meaning universalism, just as they have a much grander view of reality. They understand God, and they understand sin, and they understand redemption, and they understand all these things, and it causes them to look out in the world and to live out in the world differently. It'd be really interesting to have a conversation about what would it look like to be that person.
Mhm.
What would be
Mhm.
different about my life if I were living, if I were that person? How would I?
Yeah.
What would be different?
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
I'm just going
Yeah, and
through
that
answers myself
yeah,
right now.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's, we're going to go through some of the individual aspects of the sin and then the virtue and but I do think look at it from a big picture standpoint first, like we're looking at this week and saying like, okay, just describe that individual. you know, how do
That's it.
they, yeah, how do they, how do they drink their coffee? How do they interact with the person at the grocery store? How do they interact with their coworkers? How are they responding to difficulty and how are they responding to the temptations that are in front of all of us? The potential dopamine hits that you're talking about, and even others as well. How do they respond? And and I think if you were to look at it, there, you could even boil that image of that person down to a couple of words. Like how would you describe them in just a couple of
Hmm.
words?
Hmm.
What's the demeanor that they're bringing forward?
Yeah.
But that's a,
Have
that's
you
a great
met
point.
them? Have you met them? Yeah.
Have you
Do you
have you
know
met
people?
someone that's been? Yeah, yeah,
I do.
yeah,
I've got
yeah,
one. His
yeah,
name is Leonard Helser. Leonard Helser.
yeah,
I bought a house from him.
yeah,
I'll bring him
yeah.
up some other time.
Well, that's great. Pastor John, thank you so much for hanging out. If anyone has missed this week's message in our series or any of our previous series, go to our website, fpclakeland.org. The worship page has the sermon archive tab where you can watch complete services, both classic and our modern worship service, our Vine service. You can also find us on youtube.com/FPC Lakeland, where you can find numerous services, also concerts, Bible studies. All of our podcasts are there now. Even since before we were doing video, the audio is there. And wherever you're listening to this podcast, whether it's the Apple Podcast platform, the Google Play platform, or YouTube, we encourage you to hit the subscribe button and the notification icon so that you can be dinged when a new episode drops. More and more people. We got 5-star reviews on Apple Podcast. I noticed the
Nice.
other day several
Nice.
5-star
Nice.
reviews. You can do that as well if you're so
Please
inclined. It
do.
helps people find. Yeah, helps people find podcasts and sermons as well, everything else. And you can see all of this on our Church Center app, which you can download from your app store as you search for First Presbyterian Church in Lakeland, Florida.
Can we
Pastor
take
John,
one more second to do a
absolutely.
quick announcement? And that
Sure,
is to
sure.
remind everybody that beginning Wednesday night, this is Tuesday, so beginning tomorrow night, which will be February 19th, at 8 o'clock. They're going to be ripping up tiles around here, so it's a very practical announcement. But so if you're
Yeah.
involved in the life of the church, ask your leaders about what's changing and how you get into spaces and how you get out of spaces over the next week and a half or so, because we've got
Yeah.
some projects going on around the church and they're going to be disruptive.
Yeah. We'll not cancel our services on Sunday, so please don't people come on Sundays. And even the week that the tiles are ripped up, we're still having services. Things will be pretty well safe for you to walk on it, and then the following week they'll start doing all the polishing. Not at this point, not canceling anything significantly. So, but yeah, check with the leaders to find out where things are happening. There will be some entry points, but should only last 1 week for different entrances and everything like that. Pastor John, thank you so much for hanging out, and for everyone else, we will see you all next time.